The 2,100-pound Brahman bull stopped mid-breath, his massive black and rust-red frame trembling as 68-year-old Sarah Mae Hutchinson approached his concrete cell. Steam rose from his nostrils in the Texas heat, but tears, actual tears, streamed down his scarred face. This wasn't just any bull. This was Thunderbolt, the same beast that had killed her husband Harold 3 years ago. Dorothy Jenkins dropped her clipboard, the metal clattering against the shelter floor as other volunteers backed away in stunned silence. The bull's amber eyes locked onto Sarah Mae's weathered face, recognition flickering between them like electricity. Sarah Mae's arthritic fingers clutched Harold's wedding ring, still warm against her chest after all these years of grief and sleepless nights. The woman who once taught Sunday school now stood before her husband's killer, not with hatred burning in her heart, but with a leather leash in her trembling hands. "I'm here to adopt him," she whispered. Who saves the soul that destroyed everything they loved? And why was Thunderbolt scheduled to die in exactly 72 hours? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Millbrook, Texas, had always been the kind of place where everybody knew your business before you did. Population 3,500, scattered across drought-cracked ranch land, where the Brazos River meandered like a lazy snake through cotton fields and cattle pastures. The town square still boasted a Confederate monument that sparked heated city council debates, while Main Street lined itself with brick storefronts that had seen better decades. Here, a man's word meant something. Church attendance was expected, and folks still waved from their pickup trucks. Sarah Mae Hutchinson had called this place home for 68 years, teaching 3rd grade at Millbrook Elementary until Harold's death forced her into early retirement. Now she survived on $1,247 a month in Social Security, every penny counted twice before spending. The modest white house on Pecan Street had been Harold's pride. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a wraparound porch where they'd shared sweet tea and dreams of grandchildren who never came. 3 years of widowhood had carved deep lines around her steel-gray eyes. Her silver hair, once carefully styled for Sunday service, now hung limp beneath a faded John Deere cap that still smelled like Harold's aftershave. Arthritis had gnarled her hands, but they remained steady enough to grip the steering wheel of Harold's rusted Ford pickup, steady enough to sign adoption papers that would change everything. The Brazos County Animal Shelter sat on 10 acres of scrubland outside town limits, a collection of concrete block buildings and chain-link runs that housed society's unwanted. Dorothy Mae Jenkins had managed the facility for 15 years, watching budget cuts shrink staff and resources while the number of abandoned animals grew. At 72, Dorothy possessed the no-nonsense wisdom of a woman who'd buried 2 husbands and raised 5 children on a secretary's salary. Thunderbolt occupied the isolation pen behind the main building, a reinforced concrete enclosure designed for dangerous animals. The massive Brahman bull stood 8 feet at the shoulder, his black coat gleaming with reddish-brown highlights that caught the afternoon sun. Deep scars crisscrossed his hide, some from barbed wire, others from sources Dorothy preferred not to imagine. His left horn had been partially broken, leaving a jagged stub that added to his fearsome appearance. But it was his eyes that haunted visitors. Large and amber, they held an intelligence that seemed almost human, an awareness that set him apart from ordinary livestock. Those same eyes had watched Harold Hutchinson die on that terrible October night 3 years ago, had witnessed events that transformed a gentle ranch bull into the most feared animal in East Texas. Blake Morrison controlled half the county through his law practice and political connections. Harold's stepson had inherited his mother's calculating nature along with her sharp cheekbones and cold blue eyes. At 45, Blake wore expensive suits that looked out of place in Millbrook. drove a Mercedes that cost more than most folks' houses, and spoke with the polished confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. His 10-year-old son, Caleb, possessed his grandmother's delicate features, but his grandfather, Harold's gentle spirit, a combination that often put him at odds with his ambitious father. The morning of October 15th marked 3 years to the day since Harold Hutchinson's death, and Sarah May had planned to join him. She'd written letters to her distant relatives, paid her final bills, and placed Harold's .38 revolver on the kitchen table beside a bottle of his heart medication, enough pills to stop the loneliness forever. But something had pulled her to the shelter instead. Maybe Harold's voice in her dreams, maybe just the stubborn streak that had kept her teaching rowdy third graders for 40 years. Dorothy had been surprised to see her old friend shuffling through the front door, clutching a manila envelope containing her life savings. "Sarah May, honey, what brings you out here?" Dorothy had asked, her weathered hands sorting through adoption paperwork. The shelter smelled of disinfectant and desperation, echoing with the sounds of dogs barking and cats mewing for attention. "I want to see him," Sarah May had whispered, her voice barely audible above the animal chorus. "The bull." Dorothy's face had gone white. Everyone in Millbrook knew the story. How Thunderbolt had trampled Harold in the ranch's feed barn, how Sarah May had found her husband's broken body the next morning. The bull had been sold immediately to Blake Morrison's operation, eventually ending up at the shelter after a series of incidents that left him labeled too dangerous for placement. "Sarah, that animal—" "I know what he is," Sarah May had interrupted, steel creeping into her voice. "I also know what I am, a foolish old woman with nothing left to lose." The adoption process had taken 4 hours. Sarah May had signed liability waivers, paid the $500 fee that depleted her emergency fund, and arranged for livestock transport that would cost another $300. Dorothy had pleaded with her throughout, citing insurance concerns and city ordinances. But Sarah May's determination had proven immovable as a granite headstone. Now, standing in her backyard at sunset, Sarah May watched Thunderbolt explore his new domain. The bull moved with surprising grace for his massive size, investigating the oak tree where Harold had hung their old rope swing, sniffing the vegetable garden that had gone to weeds since the funeral. When their eyes met across the yard, something passed between them, recognition perhaps, or shared grief. "Easy, big fella," Sarah May murmured, approaching slowly with a bucket of feed corn. "We're both survivors now." Thunderbolt's ears swiveled toward her voice, but he didn't retreat. Instead, he lowered his enormous head, allowing her arthritic fingers to touch his scarred muzzle. His skin felt warm and soft, nothing like the monster she'd imagined for 3 years. The peaceful moment shattered when tires screeched in her driveway. Car doors slammed and angry voices erupted from her front yard. Sarah May sighed, recognizing Blake Morrison's Mercedes and the white animal control van behind it. "Mrs. Hutchinson!" Blake's voice carried the authority of courtrooms and boardrooms. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Sarah May made her way around the house, Thunderbolt following at a respectful distance. Blake stood on her front porch in his $1,000 suit, flanked by Animal Control Officer Eddie Martinez and Deputy Sheriff Tommy Watson. Behind them, neighbors had begun gathering on the street, drawn by the commotion. "I'm exercising my property rights," Sarah May replied calmly. "Same as you would." Blake's face flushed red. "That animal killed my stepfather. It's a menace to public safety." "According to who?" Sarah May crossed her arms, surprised by her own boldness. "You weren't there that night, Blake." "None of us were." Officer Martinez stepped forward, clipboard in hand. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but city ordinance prohibits livestock over 1,500 pounds within city limits. This bull has to go." "Since when?" Sarah May demanded. "The Hendersons kept draft horses until last year." "Emergency ordinance," Blake interjected smoothly. Passed by City Council last month for public safety reasons. The lie hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. Sarah May had attended every council meeting for 2 years, fighting budget cuts that threatened the library and senior center. No livestock ordinance had been discussed. You're giving me 72 hours to comply, Martinez continued reluctantly. After that, the animal will be impounded and— He couldn't finish the sentence. And destroyed, Blake completed coldly, like it should have been 3 years ago. As the officials departed and neighbors whispered among themselves, Sarah May felt Thunderbolt's massive presence behind her. The bull's breathing was steady, calm, as if he understood the stakes better than anyone. When she turned to face him, his amber eyes held no fear, only patient resignation. "Not if I can help it," Sarah May whispered, stroking his neck. "We've got 3 days to prove you're worth saving." But proving innocence to a town that had already made up its mind would require more than an old woman's faith. It would require a miracle, and Sarah May hadn't believed in those since the night Harold died. The story broke on KBTX News at 6 o'clock the next morning. Sarah May sat in Harold's recliner, sipping black coffee and watching her quiet life explode across television screens throughout East Texas. The headline crawled beneath footage of Thunderbolt grazing peacefully in her backyard. Widow adopts bull that killed her husband. Reporter Amanda Walsh stood at Sarah May's front gate, microphone in hand, spinning a tale that bore little resemblance to reality. This controversial adoption has divided the community of Millbrook, raising questions about public safety and animal rights. We go now to Blake Morrison, local attorney and stepson of the victim. Blake's polished face filled the screen, his expression carefully crafted to convey grief and concern. "My family is devastated by this insensitive decision. That animal took Harold's life, and now Mrs. Hutchinson is putting our entire community at risk. We're exploring all legal options to protect our neighbors." Sarah May's phone began ringing at 6:15 a.m. and didn't stop. Local newspapers, radio stations, even a producer from Good Morning America wanted her story. She unplugged the phone after the 15th call, but the damage was done. By noon, protesters had gathered outside her house, some supporting her right to keep Thunderbolt, others demanding the bull's immediate removal. Dorothy arrived at lunchtime carrying a casserole and wearing a grim expression. "City Council's called an emergency meeting for tonight," she announced, settling into Harold's old chair. "Blake's got 3 council members in his pocket already." "What about the others?" Sarah May asked, watching Thunderbolt through the kitchen window. The bull had positioned himself between the house and the street, as if sensing the growing hostility. "Mary Ellen Peterson might vote with us. She's got a soft spot for lost causes. But Tom Rodriguez and Jim Baker are worried about liability insurance. One lawsuit could bankrupt the city." The afternoon brought unexpected allies. Vietnam veteran Carl Washington parked his wheelchair on Sarah May's porch, declaring he wouldn't move until justice was served. His presence drew other veterans, men who understood what it meant to be judged by your worst moment rather than your character. By evening, a dozen folding chairs had materialized on the lawn, occupied by weathered men sharing coffee and war stories. "That bull's got the same look I seen in good soldiers who'd been through hell," Carl observed, watching Thunderbolt's careful movements. "Ain't meanness in them eyes. It's sadness." The emergency city council meeting at 7 p.m. packed Millbrook's small community center beyond capacity. Sarah May sat in the front row, flanked by Dorothy and Carl, while Blake commanded a table of lawyers near the side wall. Mayor Patricia Collins, a nervous woman who'd inherited the position after her husband's heart attack, called for order with a gavel that sounded like distant thunder. "We're here to discuss Ordinance 2024-47 regarding dangerous animals within city limits," Mayor Collins announced, her voice shaking slightly. Mr. Morrison, you've requested this emergency hearing. Blake rose smoothly, his presence commanding the room. Thank you, Mayor Collins. 3 years ago, that bull killed my stepfather in a savage attack. Now it's been brought into a residential neighborhood, endangering children and families. The city has a legal obligation to protect its citizens. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Sarah May felt her heart hammering against her ribs, her hands trembling in her lap. When Mayor Collins asked if she wished to respond, her voice emerged as barely a whisper. "Harold loved animals," she began, then stopped, overwhelmed by the weight of 100 staring eyes. Dorothy squeezed her shoulder and Carl nodded encouragement. That bull was Harold's pride and joy. He hand-raised him from a calf, spent hours training him. Something went wrong that night, but it wasn't Thunderbolt's fault. Then whose fault was it? Blake demanded, his composure cracking slightly. The bull trampled an innocent man to death. The question hung in the air like smoke, and Sarah May realized she didn't have an answer, not yet. The city council voted 4-1 to uphold the emergency ordinance, giving Sarah May 48 hours to remove Thunderbolt or face criminal charges. Only Mary Ellen Peterson cast a dissenting vote, her weathered rancher's hands shaking as she raised them in defiance of political pressure. The crowd dispersed into the humid Texas night, leaving Sarah May feeling more alone than she had since Harold's funeral. But loneliness, she discovered, was relative. By sunrise, her modest house had transformed into an unlikely headquarters for what local media dubbed the Thunderbolt Brigade. Carl Washington had spent the night on her porch in his wheelchair, wrapped in an army blanket that smelled of mothballs and memories. 3 other veterans joined him at dawn, followed by Dorothy with a box of donuts and enough coffee to fuel a small revolution. The phone calls had resumed with religious fervor. CNN wanted an exclusive interview. The Humane Society offered legal support. A children's book author from California promised to donate proceeds from Thunderbolt's Second Chance to Sarah May's cause. Most surprisingly, a veterinary behaviorist from Texas A&M volunteered to evaluate Thunderbolt free of charge. Dr. Rebecca Martinez arrived that afternoon in a dusty pickup truck loaded with equipment that looked more suited to wildlife research than domestic animal care. At 35, she possessed the no-nonsense efficiency of someone accustomed to working with dangerous animals, her dark hair pulled back severely and her hands bearing the scars of countless encounters with teeth and claws. "I've reviewed the police reports from your husband's death," Dr. Martinez explained, setting up a video camera near Thunderbolt's makeshift pen. "The physical evidence doesn't support the narrative of an aggressive attack." Sarah May's heart stuttered. "What do you mean?" "Harold's injuries were consistent with being crushed by heavy machinery, not trampled by a bull. There were no hoof marks on his clothing, no puncture wounds from horns. The coroner noted this in his report, but it was overlooked in the rush to blame the animal." The revelation hit Sarah May like a physical blow. She sank onto Harold's workbench, struggling to process information that could rewrite 3 years of grief and guilt. Then, what happened that night? That's what we need to figure out. Dr. Martinez approached Thunderbolt with professional caution, noting his posture and eye contact. This bull shows classic signs of trauma: hypervigilance, startle responses, but no inherent aggression. He's been severely abused, probably with electric prods and restraint systems. The examination took 2 hours. Dr. Martinez documented every scar, photographed Thunderbolt's reactions to various stimuli, and conducted basic behavioral tests that revealed his intelligence and gentle nature. The bull allowed her to examine his broken horn, his breathing steady despite obvious discomfort. "Someone's been using him as a fighting bull," Dr. Martinez concluded grimly. "The scarring patterns are consistent with forced combat training. Electric prod burns, chain abrasions from heavy restraints. This animal has endured systematic torture." Dorothy gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Blake Morrison bought him from the estate sale, said he needed breeding stock for his ranch operation. "This bull hasn't been used for breeding," Dr. Martinez replied flatly. "He's been conditioned for violence through pain and fear. The fact that he's remained docile despite this treatment is remarkable." That evening brought an unexpected visitor. Young Caleb Morrison appeared at Sarah May's back gate as shadows lengthened across the yard, his 10-year-old frame small against the gathering dusk. He'd been crying, his freckled cheeks streaked with tears, his cowboy's jersey torn at the shoulder. "Mrs. Hutchinson?" His voice carried the particular tremor of childhood fear. "Can I see Thunderbolt?" Sarah May glanced toward the street, expecting Blake's Mercedes to appear any moment. "Does your daddy know you're here, sweetheart?" Caleb shook his head, wiping his nose on his sleeve. "He's at another meeting with his lawyers. Says he's going to make sure Thunderbolt dies tomorrow." The blunt words from such a young mouth sent ice through Sarah May's veins. She knelt to Caleb's eye level, noting the way he flinched when she reached toward him, a reaction she recognized from years of teaching children who'd learned to expect pain from adult hands. "Why did you want to see him?" she asked gently. "Because he's not bad," Caleb whispered, glancing toward where Thunderbolt grazed peacefully near the oak tree. "Everyone says he is, but he's not. He used to be Grandpa Harold's friend." Sarah May felt her world tilt slightly. "You remember Harold?" "Course I do. He taught me to fish and told me stories about the old days. Thunderbolt used to follow us around like a big dog. Grandpa said he was the smartest bull in Texas, could open gates and everything." The child's memories painted a picture Sarah May had never fully understood. Harold had mentioned Thunderbolt frequently during their last months together, but she'd dismissed his stories as the fond exaggerations of a rancher talking about his stock. She'd never realized the depth of attachment between man and animal. "Caleb, what do you remember about the night Harold died?" The boy's face went pale, his small hands twisting together. "I'm not supposed to talk about it." "Daddy says it would hurt people's feelings." "Sometimes talking about hurt feelings is the only way to make them better," Sarah May said carefully. "I promise you won't get in trouble." Caleb looked toward Thunderbolt, who had wandered closer during their conversation. The massive bull stopped at the fence line, his amber eyes focused on the child with unmistakable recognition. When Caleb extended his hand through the chain link, Thunderbolt gently nuzzled his palm. "He remembers me," Caleb breathed, wonder replacing fear in his voice. "Daddy said he was too stupid to remember anything." "What else did your daddy say?" The question hung between them like smoke from a distant fire. Caleb's expression shifted, childhood innocence warring with adult secrets too heavy for such small shoulders. When he finally spoke, his words were barely audible above the evening chorus of crickets and tree frogs. "He said if I ever told anyone what really happened, they'd take me away from him forever. But Mrs. Hutchinson—" Caleb's voice cracked with the weight of terrible knowledge. "Thunderbolt didn't hurt Grandpa Harold. He was trying to save him." The revelation hit Sarah May like lightning, illuminating 3 years of darkness with sudden, terrible clarity. She pulled Caleb close, feeling his thin body trembling against hers, and finally understood why Blake Morrison was so desperate to see Thunderbolt destroyed. It wasn't about public safety or legal liability. It was about silencing the only witness to what really happened that October night. A witness who couldn't speak, but whose very existence threatened to expose a truth that Blake would kill to keep buried. As if summoned by Sarah May's thoughts, headlights swept across her driveway. Blake's Mercedes pulled to the curb with predatory precision, and she felt Caleb stiffen in her arms. The man who emerged from the luxury vehicle bore little resemblance to the polished attorney who'd charmed city councils and convinced judges. This Blake Morrison moved with barely controlled violence, his expensive suit rumpled, his face dark with rage that made Sarah May's blood run cold. "Caleb!" His voice cut through the night air like a whip crack. "Get away from that animal and get in the car! Now!" But Caleb didn't move. Instead, he pressed closer to Sarah May, his small hand finding hers as Thunderbolt positioned himself protectively between them and the approaching threat. The bull's massive head lowered, his muscles tensing beneath scarred hide, and for the first time since bringing him home, Sarah May glimpsed the warrior that 3 years of abuse hadn't quite managed to break. "That boy's been filling your head with fairy tales," Blake snarled, stopping just outside the reach of Thunderbolt's horns. "Children have active imaginations, especially traumatized children." "Then you won't mind if he tells his fairy tale to the sheriff," Sarah May replied, surprised by the steel in her own voice. Blake's laugh held no warmth. "Who's going to believe a disturbed child over a respected member of the community? Tomorrow, that animal dies, and these ridiculous accusations die with him." But as he spoke, his eyes never left Thunderbolt's face, and Sarah May realized that Blake Morrison was afraid, not of the bull's size or strength, but of what those intelligent amber eyes had witnessed on a dark October night 3 years ago. The courthouse steps buzzed with activity as dawn broke over Millbrook on the final day of Thunderbolt's reprieve. News vans lined Main Street like mechanical vultures, their satellite dishes reaching toward a sky that promised another scorching Texas morning. Sarah May clutched Caleb's small hand as they climbed the limestone steps, flanked by Dorothy and Carl Washington, whose wheelchair had been decorated overnight with yellow ribbons by supporters who'd gathered from across East Texas. Judge William Crawford's courtroom had never seen such a crowd. Every seat was occupied, with overflow spectators lining the walls despite fire code violations that nobody seemed inclined to enforce. The media presence was overwhelming. Cameras from 3 major networks, reporters from newspapers as far away as Dallas and Houston, and a documentary crew that had driven through the night from Austin. Sarah May took her place at the plaintiff's table beside a young legal aid attorney named Maria Santos, who'd volunteered her services after seeing the story on the evening news. Across the aisle, Blake Morrison commanded a phalanx of expensive suits, his confidence radiating through the packed courtroom like heat from a furnace. Judge Crawford, a fair man worn down by 30 years of small-town politics and impossible decisions, called the emergency hearing to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. The case before him was unprecedented in Brazos County, a civil challenge to an emergency ordinance with life and death hanging in the balance. This court will hear arguments regarding the enforcement of Emergency Ordinance 2024-47, Judge Crawford announced, his weathered face betraying no emotion. "Mr. Morrison, as the petitioner for this ordinance, you may present your case." Blake rose with theatrical precision, his opening statement a masterful blend of legal arguments and emotional manipulation. He painted Thunderbolt as a continuing threat to public safety, citing statistics about bull attacks and insurance liability concerns. His presentation was polished, professional, and utterly convincing to anyone who hadn't looked into those intelligent amber eyes. "Your Honor, this isn't about vengeance," Blake concluded, his voice heavy with manufactured sorrow. "This is about preventing another tragedy. My stepfather, Harold Hutchinson, died because of this animal's violence, and we cannot allow sentiment to override our responsibility to protect the innocent." Maria Santos rose to present Sarah May's defense with the passionate intensity of someone fighting her first major case. She challenged the emergency ordinance's legal basis, questioned the hasty timeline, and presented Dr. Martinez's veterinary evaluation as evidence of Thunderbolt's gentle nature. But without concrete proof of Blake's deception, her arguments felt like morning mist against concrete walls. The turning point came when Sarah May took the witness stand. Her voice shook as she described the past 3 days, the community support that had rallied around Thunderbolt's cause, and her growing certainty that the bull posed no threat to anyone. But when Blake's lead attorney began cross-examination, her testimony crumbled under professional pressure. "Mrs. Hutchinson, isn't it true that you suffer from depression following your husband's death?" The attorney's voice was silk wrapped around a blade. "Haven't you been taking medication for anxiety and emotional instability?" Sarah May felt the courtroom spinning around her, the weight of public scrutiny crushing down like Texas heat. Yes, after Harold died, I needed help." "And isn't it true that you attempted to purchase a firearm just days before adopting this bull?" The question hit like a physical blow. Sarah May's plan to end her own life, derailed by her inexplicable decision to save Thunderbolt, now became evidence of mental instability. She saw heads shaking in the gallery, heard whispers questioning her judgment, and felt her cause slipping away like water through her fingers. Blake's victory seemed assured until 10-year-old Caleb Morrison stood up in the gallery, his thin voice cutting through the courtroom's tension like a church bell through morning fog. "That's not what happened," he said, his words carrying the absolute certainty that only children possess. "Daddy's lying about everything." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Blake lunged toward his son, his composure finally cracking completely, while bailiffs moved to restore order. Judge Crawford's gavel echoed like gunshots as he demanded silence, but nothing could contain the electricity of truth finally breaking free. "Your Honor," Maria Santos called out above the tumult, "I request permission to call Caleb Morrison as a witness." "Absolutely not," Blake roared, his face purple with rage. "That boy is 10 years old. He's confused, traumatized." "Then you won't object to his testimony," Judge Crawford replied coolly, his experienced eyes taking in Blake's panic with growing interest. "Son, come forward." What followed was the most extraordinary 20 minutes in Brazos County legal history. Caleb Morrison, speaking with the clarity that comes from 3 years of carrying unbearable secrets, described the night Harold Hutchinson died with devastating precision. He'd been staying at the ranch that weekend, sleeping in the guest room while his parents attended a legal conference in Houston. Around midnight, he'd heard voices from the barn, his grandfather Harold's confused rambling and his father Blake's angry responses. Harold had been having one of his confused nights, wandering the property in his pajamas, disoriented by the early signs of dementia that the family had been hiding from neighbors and friends. Grandpa Harold got mixed up and went into the feed room where the big machines were, Caleb testified, his young voice steady despite tears streaming down his cheeks. The conveyor belt was running and he got too close. Thunderbolt kept trying to push him away from the dangerous parts, but Grandpa wouldn't listen. The courtroom was silent as death, every person hanging on the child's words. Then Daddy came in and I thought he would help, but he just stood there watching. When Grandpa got caught in the machinery, Daddy turned off the lights and told me to go back to bed. He said if I ever told anyone what I saw, they'd blame me for not stopping it. Blake Morrison's world collapsed in real time. His face went ashen as his son's testimony destroyed 3 years of careful lies, his legal team abandoning their posts like rats fleeing a sinking ship. The truth was finally free, and it painted a picture more horrible than anyone had imagined. Not a bull's unprovoked attack, but a man's calculated decision to let his stepfather die rather than risk his own inheritance. Thunderbolt tried to save Grandpa Harold, Caleb concluded, his small frame shaking with emotion. Then Daddy sold him to mean people who hurt him with electric sticks and made him fight other bulls. But he never stopped being good. He just got scared. Judge Crawford recessed the court for 30 minutes, while sheriff's deputies took Blake Morrison into custody on charges of evidence tampering, insurance fraud, and negligent homicide. When the hearing resumed, the emergency ordinance was struck down unanimously, and Sarah May was awarded permanent custody of Thunderbolt, along with damages that would ensure both their futures. But the real victory wasn't legal or financial. It was the sight of Caleb Morrison running across Sarah May's backyard that evening, his laughter echoing through the oak trees as Thunderbolt lumbered behind him like an enormous, devoted guardian. Three broken souls, woman, child, and bull, had found each other in their darkest hour and discovered that sometimes the most unlikely families are the strongest ones of all. 3 weeks after Blake Morrison's arrest, Sarah May's world began to crumble in ways she hadn't anticipated. The legal victory that had saved Thunderbolt's life came with devastating consequences that rippled through her small existence like aftershocks from an earthquake. The medical bills arrived first. $47,000 for her emergency room visit during the court proceedings when her heart condition had flared under stress. Her Medicare coverage barely dented the mountain of debt, and the payment plans offered by Millbrook General Hospital would consume her entire Social Security income for the next 8 years. Sarah May sat at her kitchen table on a sweltering August morning, surrounded by bills and collection notices, feeling the walls of Harold's modest house closing in around her. Her arthritis had worsened dramatically since the courtroom drama, making simple tasks like feeding Thunderbolt an exercise in grinding pain. Some mornings she could barely grip the coffee cup with her gnarled fingers, let alone carry 50-pound bags of feed or maintain the reinforced fencing that kept her massive companion safe from increasingly hostile neighbors. The community's initial support had evaporated like morning dew under the harsh Texas sun. Blake Morrison might have been exposed as a liar and a killer, but he'd been their liar and killer. A local boy made good who'd brought prestige and investment to their struggling town. His arrest had triggered an economic domino effect that left half of Main Street's businesses facing bankruptcy. The law firm that employed 12 people had shuttered overnight. The development project that would have brought jobs and tax revenue had died with Blake's reputation. Sarah May found herself transformed from folk hero to community pariah in the span of weeks. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her. Church attendance became an exercise in enduring pointed sermons about pride and stubborn foolishness. The grocery store clerk who'd once shared gossip and coupons now processed her purchases in cold silence. Dorothy Jenkins faced her own crisis. The city council, embarrassed by their complicity in Blake's schemes and desperate for someone to blame, had voted to terminate Dorothy's employment and close the animal shelter entirely. At 72, with no pension and minimal savings, Dorothy's future looked as bleak as an abandoned barn in winter. "Maybe they're right," Dorothy said during one of her daily visits, her voice heavy with doubt as she watched Thunderbolt graze in the makeshift pasture behind Sarah May's house. "Maybe we should have let sleeping dogs lie. Or sleeping bulls, in this case." Caleb Morrison had been placed in foster care with his maternal aunt in Houston, while social services investigated the full extent of his father's psychological manipulation. Sarah May missed the boy's daily visits more than she'd expected. His laughter had brought life back to Harold's quiet house, and his absence left an emptiness that even Thunderbolt's gentle presence couldn't fill. The physical strain of caring for a 2,100-pound animal was taking its toll on Sarah May's failing body. Thunderbolt's daily needs required hours of work that she could barely manage: hauling water, spreading hay, cleaning his shelter, maintaining fences that neighbors sabotaged under cover of darkness. Her heart medication wasn't managing her symptoms effectively anymore, leaving her breathless after minimal exertion and dizzy when she stood too quickly. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in late August. Sarah May had been struggling to repair a section of fence damaged by vandals when her chest pain spiked beyond anything she'd experienced before. She collapsed beside Thunderbolt's water trough, her vision graying at the edges, her left arm numb and useless. Thunderbolt found her there 20 minutes later, unconscious and barely breathing in the gathering dusk. The massive bull's distressed bellowing echoed across the neighborhood until Mrs. Henderson from next door, one of the few neighbors who still spoke to Sarah May, called 911. The ambulance ride to Millbrook General passed in a haze of oxygen masks and urgent voices. Sarah May drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind filled with fractured images of Harold's face, Caleb's laughter, and Thunderbolt's amber eyes filled with concern she'd never seen in a human gaze. Doctor. Patricia Wells delivered the diagnosis with the gentle firmness of someone accustomed to breaking bad news to patients who couldn't afford to hear it. Sarah May's heart was failing faster than expected. The stress of recent months had accelerated the deterioration, and without a surgical procedure she couldn't afford, she had perhaps 6 months to live. "What happens to Thunderbolt?" was Sarah May's first question upon regaining consciousness, her priorities clear despite the morphine clouding her thoughts. Dr. Wells had no answer. Animal Control had already been contacted about the dangerous animal left unattended during its owner's hospitalization. Without someone legally responsible for his care, Thunderbolt would be impounded within 48 hours and likely euthanized as a public safety measure. As Sarah May lay in her hospital bed, listening to the mechanical beeping of monitors that measured her fading life, she realized that saving Thunderbolt from Blake Morrison had only delayed the inevitable. Her own mortality would accomplish what legal challenges and community pressure had failed to achieve. The bull she'd fought so hard to protect would die because she'd been too proud, too stubborn, and too poor to recognize that love sometimes meant letting go. The revelation came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday night when Sarah May couldn't sleep, her heart medication making her feel like a hummingbird trapped in her chest. She'd been lying in the hospital bed watching raindrops race down the window when a memory surfaced with startling clarity. Something Caleb had said during his testimony that nobody had questioned at the time. Harold's dementia episodes hadn't been random wandering. They'd followed a pattern, occurring specifically on nights when Blake visited the ranch unannounced. Sarah May had dismissed this detail during the emotional chaos of the courtroom, but now it struck her as impossibly coincidental. She pressed the nurse call button with trembling fingers, requesting her personal belongings. Among Harold's effects that she'd carried like talismans, his wedding ring, his wallet, his reading glasses, she found his small appointment calendar, the one he'd kept religiously until the day he died. Sarah May flipped through the pages with growing excitement, noting Blake's visits marked in Harold's careful handwriting. Every instance of Harold's confusion corresponded exactly with Blake's unexpected appearances at the ranch. More damning still, Harold's final entry, written the day he died, contained a single line that made Sarah May's blood run cold. Blake asking about insurance papers again. Must remember to hide them better. The insurance policy. Harold's life insurance policy that had paid Blake's stepfather status as beneficiary despite the suspicious circumstances of the death. Sarah May realized with dawning horror that Harold hadn't been succumbing to dementia at all. He'd been drugged. She grabbed her phone with shaking hands and called Maria Santos, the young attorney who'd defended her in court. The call went to voicemail, but Sarah May's message was urgent enough to bring Maria rushing to the hospital at dawn, still in her pajamas and flip-flops. "We need to exhume Harold's body," Sarah May explained, her words tumbling over each other in excitement. Blake was poisoning him with something that mimicked dementia symptoms. The night Harold died, he must have given him too much. Maria's eyes widened as she studied Harold's calendar entries. Rohypnol, maybe, or scopolamine. Both can cause confusion and memory loss in small doses, but they're fatal in larger amounts. If we can prove Harold was murdered, then Blake isn't just guilty of letting him die, Sarah May finished. He's guilty of killing him. The exhumation order took 3 days to obtain, during which Sarah May discharged herself from the hospital against medical advice. She couldn't bear the thought of Thunderbolt facing impoundment alone, and her condition had stabilized enough that she could function with careful medication management. Dorothy Jenkins had moved into Sarah May's guest room, officially unemployed, but unofficially serving as both caregiver and co-conspirator. Together, they maintained Thunderbolt's care while pursuing the investigation that could vindicate them all. The toxicology results from Harold's exhumed remains arrived on a Friday afternoon that felt like Christmas morning. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the veterinary behaviorist who'd first evaluated Thunderbolt, had connected Sarah May with a forensic pathologist willing to re-examine Harold's case pro bono. Traces of zolpidem and benzodiazepines, the pathologist reported via speakerphone. Concentrations consistent with chronic low-level poisoning over several months, with a massive final dose administered within hours of death. This man didn't die in an accident. He was systematically murdered. The news broke that evening on every major network. Blake Morrison, already facing charges for evidence tampering and negligent homicide, now confronted first-degree murder charges that carried the death penalty in Texas. The story that had begun as a heartwarming tale of an elderly woman saving a bull had transformed into a criminal investigation that would dominate headlines for months. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. During the search of Blake's downtown law office, investigators discovered a safe containing documents that painted an even darker picture of his crimes. Harold's murder had been just the beginning of an elaborate insurance fraud scheme that involved at least 6 other suspicious deaths among Blake's elderly clients over the past 5 years. Each victim had been wealthy, isolated, and gradually convinced to name Blake as their beneficiary or estate executor. Each had shown sudden signs of mental deterioration before their deaths. Each had died in circumstances that generated substantial insurance payouts that Blake had managed with meticulous care. Sarah May hadn't saved just Thunderbolt's life. She'd exposed a serial killer who had been operating under everyone's noses for years, using his position as a trusted attorney to identify and eliminate vulnerable targets throughout East Texas. The financial implications were staggering. The insurance companies that had paid Blake's fraudulent claims launched immediate investigations to recover their losses. The estate proceeds from his victims' deaths were frozen pending criminal proceedings. Most importantly for Sarah May, Harold's life insurance policy was declared null and void due to the criminal circumstances of his death, triggering a wrongful death clause that entitled her to triple damages. Within a week, Sarah May went from facing financial ruin to inheriting more money than she'd ever imagined. Harold's death had been worth $100,000 to Blake as an insurance beneficiary, but as a murder victim, his estate would receive nearly $2 million in combined settlements from insurance companies desperate to avoid criminal liability. The money meant Sarah May could afford the heart surgery that would extend her life by decades. It meant Dorothy could retire with dignity instead of facing poverty. It meant Thunderbolt would have the veterinary care and proper facilities he'd never received as Blake's fighting bull. But most importantly, it meant Caleb Morrison would inherit his grandfather's estate, free from his father's criminal influence. The boy who'd found the courage to speak truth in a courtroom full of adults would grow up wealthy enough to pursue any dream, educated enough to avoid his father's moral failures, and surrounded by people who'd proven that love could triumph over greed. As Sarah May sat in Harold's recliner that night, watching Thunderbolt graze peacefully outside her window while Dorothy prepared dinner and Caleb, who'd returned from Houston for the weekend, practiced piano in the front room, she finally understood what Harold had been trying to tell her in those strange dreams that had led her to the animal shelter. Sometimes the most broken souls carry the greatest capacity for healing. Sometimes the most fearsome appearances hide the gentlest hearts, and sometimes saving one life opens the door to saving many others. 6 months later, on a crisp December morning when Texas winter felt more like autumn anywhere else, Sarah May Hutchinson stood on the front porch of her new home, watching Thunderbolt graze in 30 acres of green pasture that stretched toward the Brazos River. The successful heart surgery had given her a decade of additional life, maybe more, and she intended to spend every precious day making up for lost time. The Hutchinson-Morrison Therapeutic Ranch occupied the property that had once been Harold's dream, a place where wounded souls, both human and animal, could find healing together. Sarah May had used Harold's insurance settlement to purchase the land back from Blake's bankruptcy estate, then dedicated the remainder to establishing a nonprofit organization that would outlive them all. Caleb Morrison, now 11 and legally adopted by Sarah May after his father's conviction, raced across the pasture on his new quarter horse, his laughter echoing across the rolling hills. The boy had grown 3 inches since moving in permanently, his freckled face filling out with the healthy glow of a child who no longer carried adult secrets. Behind him, Thunderbolt lumbered along like a massive, devoted dog, his scarred hide gleaming in the morning sunlight. "Grandma Sarah," Caleb called, using the title that made Sarah May's heart swell every time she heard it. "Thunderbolt learned a new trick. Watch this." The boy dismounted and gave a series of hand signals that Dr. Martinez had developed specifically for therapy work. Thunderbolt responded by lowering himself carefully to the ground, creating a living mountain that visiting children could climb safely under supervision. The same bull that had once been labeled the most dangerous animal in East Texas now served as a gentle giant who helped traumatized kids rebuild their trust in the world. Dorothy Jenkins emerged from the ranch's main building, her arms full of files and her face bearing the satisfied expression of someone whose life had found unexpected purpose. At 73, she directed the ranch's daily operations with the efficiency of a woman who'd spent decades managing chaos and limited resources. The modest salary Sarah May paid her was supplemented by speaking engagements and consulting fees from animal welfare organizations across the country. "The Henderson family is here for their appointment," Dorothy announced, gesturing toward a dusty pickup truck pulling up the gravel drive. "Billy's been having nightmares since the car accident, and his parents think some time with the animals might help." Sarah May nodded, watching as a nervous 8-year-old boy climbed out of the truck, flanked by parents who radiated the particular exhaustion of people who'd tried everything conventional medicine had to offer. Billy Henderson had survived a crash that killed his younger sister, carrying survivor's guilt that no amount of therapy had been able to touch. "Let's introduce him to Buttercup first," Sarah May suggested, referring to a gentle Jersey cow who'd been rescued from a factory farm. Sometimes the smaller animals are less intimidating for newcomers. The Hutchinson-Morrison Therapeutic Ranch had evolved far beyond Sarah May's original vision. What began as a safe haven for Thunderbolt had grown into a comprehensive facility serving veterans with PTSD, children recovering from trauma, and elderly residents battling depression and isolation. The waiting list stretched 6 months, with referrals coming from hospitals, social workers, and military chaplains throughout the Southwest. Dr. Rebecca Martinez had established a research partnership with Texas A&M University, studying the measurable benefits of human-animal interaction for trauma recovery. Her preliminary findings were revolutionary. Patients who worked with the ranch's animals showed faster healing times, reduced medication needs, and significantly lower rates of depression and anxiety compared to traditional therapy groups. Carl Washington had become the ranch's unofficial historian, documenting every success story and near miracle that occurred within its boundaries. His memoir, Rolling with Thunder, A Veteran's Guide to Second Chances, had become a bestseller, with proceeds funding scholarships for military families seeking animal-assisted therapy. The ranch housed 43 rescued animals, each with their own story of abuse, abandonment, or neglect. There was Princess, a one-eyed Arabian mare who'd been starved nearly to death before teaching disabled children how to ride. Zeus, a German shepherd who'd failed police training due to excessive gentleness, now served as a therapy dog for elderly dementia patients. And Martha, a pot-bellied pig who'd been purchased as a novelty pet and abandoned when she grew too large, now helped autistic children learn social communication skills. But Thunderbolt remained the ranch's crown jewel, his transformation from feared beast to healing angel, capturing the imagination of visitors from around the world. His gentle interactions with traumatized children had been featured in documentaries, medical journals, and a children's book series that taught kids about overcoming fear and prejudice. The Christmas Eve celebration had become an annual tradition that drew hundreds of visitors to the ranch. Local churches provided choirs, restaurants donated food, and the entire community of Millbrook, which had eventually embraced Sarah May as their hometown hero, turned out for an evening of fellowship and hope. As the sun set on this particular Christmas Eve, Sarah May found herself sitting in Harold's old rocking chair on the ranch house porch, wrapped in the quilt Dorothy had made from his flannel shirts. Caleb curled up beside her, reading aloud from A Christmas Carol, while Thunderbolt dozed peacefully in the nearby pasture, surrounded by a dozen other rescued animals who'd learned that safety meant staying close to the gentle giant. "Do you think Daddy Harold can see us?" Caleb asked during a pause between chapters, his voice carrying the philosophical curiosity of childhood. Sarah May stroked his sandy hair, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think Harold's been watching over us this whole time, sweetheart. I think he knew exactly what he was doing when he led me to that shelter." The boy nodded solemnly, then brightened. "Maybe he's watching Daddy Blake too, making sure he doesn't hurt anybody else." Blake Morrison was serving 3 consecutive life sentences at the Huntsville State Penitentiary, his appeals exhausted and his reputation destroyed beyond any hope of rehabilitation. The 6 additional murder convictions had made him one of Texas's most notorious serial killers, a cautionary tale about the corruption that could flourish behind respectable facades. "I think your biological father is learning some hard lessons about the consequences of his choices," Sarah May replied carefully. "But that's not our concern anymore. We're focused on helping people heal, not on punishing people who've hurt others." The ranch's impact extended far beyond its physical boundaries. Sarah May had testified before Congress about the therapeutic benefits of animal-assisted intervention, leading to federal funding for similar programs at VA hospitals across the country. Her story had inspired a television movie, 3 documentary films, and countless news features that brought attention to the broader issues of elder abuse, animal welfare, and the healing power of unlikely friendships. But the statistics and accolades mattered less to Sarah May than the individual moments of transformation she witnessed daily. There was the Vietnam veteran who'd stopped having nightmares after working with Princess, the Arabian mare who'd also survived terrible trauma, the autistic teenager who'd spoken his first words while brushing Thunderbolt's coat, the elderly widow who'd found reason to live again after volunteering to help feed the farm's growing menagerie. Each success story reminded Sarah May that her decision to adopt the most hated bull in the shelter had been about much more than saving one animal's life. It had been about proving that redemption was possible, that love could overcome fear, and that sometimes the most broken souls carried the greatest capacity for healing others. As the Christmas Eve stars appeared in the clear Texas sky, Sarah May felt Harold's presence as surely as if he were sitting beside her on the porch. 3 years ago, she'd stood in an animal shelter with a rope in her truck and despair in her heart, planning to end a life that had lost all meaning. Tonight, she was surrounded by family she'd chosen and animals she'd saved, presiding over a legacy that would continue long after her own time ended. Thunderbolt raised his massive head from the pasture, his amber eyes reflecting the porch lights as he gazed toward the house with unmistakable affection. The bull, who'd been condemned to die for crimes he'd never committed, now embodied everything Sarah May believed about second chances, forgiveness, and the transformative power of unconditional love. "Thank you, Harold," she whispered into the star-filled night, her words carrying across the pasture to the gentle giant who'd brought them all together. "Thank you for showing me that sometimes the most beautiful endings grow from the darkest beginnings." Caleb had fallen asleep against her shoulder, and Dorothy was humming Christmas carols in the kitchen while preparing hot chocolate for the last visitors of the evening. Somewhere in the distance, church bells chimed midnight, welcoming Christmas Day with the promise of hope, healing, and endless possibilities for hearts brave enough to love without conditions. Sarah May Hutchinson was finally home. Sometimes, life hands us our greatest blessings wrapped in packages we'd never choose to open. Sarah May thought her story ended at 68 with a broken heart and empty house, but it was just beginning. When she walked into that shelter asking for the most hated bull, she wasn't just saving Thunderbolt, she was discovering that our most meaningful chapters often start when we think the book is closing. Her courage to love what others feared created a family she never expected, an adopted grandson who calls her grandma, a best friend who found purpose again, and a community that learned the difference between judgment and justice. The ranch that grew from her stubborn faith now helps hundreds of wounded souls, both human and animal, find healing together. At 69, Sarah May isn't just surviving on Social Security, she's thriving as a nationally recognized advocate, author, and grandmother. Her story proves that it's never too late for love to surprise us, for purpose to find us, and for our golden years to become our greatest adventure. Sometimes, the most beautiful second acts begin with the simplest decision, choosing love over fear, hope over resignation, and action over acceptance of what seems impossible. Questions for our community. What impossible dream have you been afraid to pursue because of your age? When has choosing compassion over judgment changed your life unexpectedly? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else to take that brave first step.